Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, all these past lectures we've been discussing theories of the firm and how a particular firm can try to maximize its profits when it is confronted with different market structures. That is, when it is operating in an environment where there is perfect competition or when it itself forms the industry. Now, some of you might find this part of the course a little bit hard because very few of you have actually operated or owned firms yourself. But once you go out in the business, and hopefully many of you will be doing that 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, then you will recognize the importance of what you are learning today. Now, you remember I left the last lecture on price discrimination. We had concluded discussion on perfect competition and monopoly, and then I had introduced the topic of price discrimination to you. However, before I tackle that, I want to just do a little recap on what we've learned till the last lecture. Now, if you remember, we started by looking at how firms would choose the output level at which they would maximize their profits. And the rule for that I gave you was that marginal revenue should equal marginal cost. That is, the addition to revenues of the additional unit of output should exactly equal the addition to costs of that additional unit of output. And that would be the top of the hill. And that would be the point where total profits of the firm would be maximized. Now, the way we did it graphically was that we saw where the MR and MC curves intersected. We took that point, we went vertically up and saw where that point hit the demand curve, and then we saw horizontally, we read off the price from the vertical axis from where the vertical line hit the demand curve. Now, we've so far discussed the two polar positions, that is, of perfect competition and monopoly. In perfect competition, we saw that the demand curve, which is the average revenue curve, was horizontal, was a straight line. Because a price-taking, perfectly competitive firm has its marginal revenue equals to price, that is, for every extra unit that it sells, it receives a given price, that is the market price. Then we had the unique case in which price was equal to marginal revenue, and because marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at the profit maximizing output, we had the case of price equaling marginal cost in perfect competition. When we compared this result with monopoly, we saw that price was not equal to marginal cost. The point of intersection of the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves still determined the profit maximizing output, but because the demand curve was a downward sloping one for a monopolist, you did not have the marginal revenue and average revenue curves aligning or being the same, and therefore you had a price which was higher than the point of intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost. And we discussed some efficiency concerns that this inequality of price and marginal cost for the case of monopoly raised. There's just one more point that I want to make in the context of this price equals marginal cost debate, which I hope will clarify some of the things that I said earlier, is that in the case of perfect competition, when price is equal to marginal cost, that point is also the bottommost point of the average cost curve. If you recall, the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost curve at its minimum point. And therefore, when price is equal to marginal cost, that point also becomes the minimum average cost point of operation for the perfectly competitive firm. I'm talking about the long run here. Yes, indeed, in the short run, the perfectly competitive firm can make profits, supernormal profits, and losses. But in the long run, it will operate at the level where price is equal to the bottommost level of average cost. And that means that the industry is producing at the lowest possible cost level. That is, if each firm in the industry is producing at the minimum point of its average cost, then the industry as a whole should be producing at a point which is efficient from a cost point of view. The other thing that we talked about was how the individual marginal cost curves could be aggregated in the case of perfect competition to make the short-run supply curve for the industry. And this was simply because price was equal to marginal cost for a perfectly competitive firm. And therefore, the relationship of quantity supplied with price and the relationship between marginal cost and quantity aligned. And therefore, we saw that the marginal cost curve for a perfectly competitive firm, at least the upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve, became equal to its supply curve. And these could then be horizontally aggregated to form the industry supply curve. However, this was not the case for a monopoly, if you remember, because for a monopoly, the marginal cost curve is not equal to the supply curve. And I have mentioned the reasons for that. That is because the price at which the monopolist produces or supplies is higher than the point at which marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. Noting the fact that a monopoly was the industry itself and therefore had immense power in setting the price that it wanted to, and we also discussed that a monopoly had a more inelastic demand, or it faced a more inelastic demand curve than perfect competition. All these raised implications for public welfare or the welfare of the society at large. And we discussed how the government could intervene to ensure that monopolies operated at a level where they produced more and charged a lower price so that the consumers were not undesirably hurt. So we introduced the whole debate of monopolies and public interest. We noted that monopolies have advantages as well, so that the answer to this question was not to dismantle every monopoly that existed out there. We noted that in some cases like WAPDA or telecommunication industry, in the telecommunications industry or airlines, it often made sense to just have one producer or just one operator, because he could produce at an average cost level which was lower than if all the competitive firms got together and produced the output. So the answer was not to dismember or dismantle a monopoly, especially when there were economies of scale reasons for the existence of the monopoly. That is, the monopoly was a natural monopoly. So the answer to that was that the government should try to regulate monopolies. How should the government try to regulate monopolies? That is, it should allow the monopolies to make only normal profits. So one, you don't want monopolies to gain supernormal profits. That would mean that their income and their wealth would be increasing over time, and that's not consistent with the income distribution goals that the government might have set. So the idea was to only allow monopolies to make a fair rate of return, a fair profit, which was for an economist, which for economists is the zero level of profits, that is normal profits. And secondly, you want the monopolies to produce at the point which is optimal or allocational-wise optimal for society. That is, the point at which goods are produced in the quantity and at the price that the society wants them to be produced. And that point, you all remember, is the price equals to marginal cost point. Now, we noted that there were two possible cases or two possible types of regulation or intervention that the government could make depending on the cost, the position of the cost curve of the monopoly. So, for example, in some cases, the government could order the monopoly to set price equals to marginal cost. But at that particular price, the monopoly's average cost curve might be higher than the price. And that means the monopoly would make a loss at that output. and that monopoly would not be willing to produce that quantity unless the government was willing to give some subsidy to the monopoly. But we noted that sometimes subsidies are difficult to manage, and therefore governments usually are content with allowing monopolies to operate where their price equals average cost, not marginal cost, but average cost, so that they make normal profits. Note that they would still be not producing at the socially optimal level, but this will be still good enough for the regulators. The second case was that when the government ordered the monopoly to set price equals to marginal cost, that could still give a price which is higher than the average cost level of the monopolist at that point of output. So if that situation arises, that is, the monopolist is still making supernormal profits, then there might be a case for taxation. You could tax away the supernormal profits of the monopoly and then distribute it to society. So those were the two cases that we discussed in the context of public interest and monopolies. We'll revisit some of this public interest debate when we discuss monopolistic competition and oligopolies, and we'll start discussion on those. But let's put them to rest for now, and let's start to talk about what we ended our previous lecture with, which is price discrimination. Now, what is price discrimination? I gave you the example of table tennis balls, in which a firm could sell table tennis balls at different prices to different individuals, right? That was an example of price discrimination. But let me try to illustrate this concept a little bit better through some more examples, and also formalize the concept of price discrimination. Now, price discrimination can be of three types. That is, there are three ways in which a producer can decide to charge different prices to different people. The first way, which is called the first degree of price discrimination, first type of price discrimination, is when a firm or a producer will charge the highest or maximum possible price that he can get from any consumer that comes to him. So if you go to a bazaar, a fruit bazaar, and you find the same bag of mangoes being sold by the same fruit seller to different individuals at different prices, that's a case of first degree price discrimination. Often you, in fact, if you are hanging around in these fruit bazaars, notice how the fruit sellers change the price that they charge depending on the customer who comes to them. So experiment this one day. Go to the fruit shop, very nicely dressed, put on a tie, put on some dark glasses, and ask for a kilo of mangoes, and ask him in a nice, sophisticated way. He will give you a price of, let's say, 50 rupees per kilo, right? Then do another experiment the next day. Go there with wearing torn or ordinary clothes, with a broken shoe, in a disheveled manner, and ask him in the local language, whether it's Punjabi or Sindhi or whatever, okay, what's the price of the mangoes? And he might quote you a price of 30 rupees. And this is the first degree price discrimination example being practiced by the fruit seller. He looks at the person and thinks, what is the maximum possible price that I can charge him? If you look like a rich person or a wealthy person, he will quote a high price. If you look like a person who is not so well-to-do, whose demand is more elastic in a way, that is, if you quote a high price, he will go to the next fruit seller, then he will charge you or quote you a fair price. So this is an example of first-degree price discrimination that all of us come across almost daily in our lives. The second-degree price discrimination relates to discriminating prices based on the quantity that a particular consumer buys from you. And this also we see, we encounter every day. Let me expand on that fruit seller example a little bit more. So you go to the fruit seller and you ask him, sir, what is the price of 1 kilo of mangoes? And he will come back to you and he'll say, the price is 45 rupees. Actually, usually says, the last price is 45 rupees, especially for you. So once he says that the last price is 45 rupees, especially for you, you can try and bargain with him once you increase the quantity. You say, well, 45 rupees you are charging me as a special favor or a special price for 1 kilo. What if I buy 2 kilos from you? Will you give me 2 kilos for 75 rupees? And he will think about it. He'll say, well, if I sell 2 kilos, then I will be able to sell more of my product. There will be less left for me to sell in the remaining part of the day, so my task will become easier. So he might be willing to sell you at, let's say, 30 rupees or something like that. So he might say, okay, I'll give you 2 kilos for 75 rupees because you are buying a larger quantity from me. And then you can further expand the quantity that you want to buy, and you can say, well, what if I buy 3 kilos from you? Will you give it to me for 100? And then he might give it to you for 100 because now you're buying 3 kilos. So as the quantity demanded by the customer increases from 1 to 2 to 3 kilos, the willingness of the shopkeeper or the fruit seller to give a lower price or offer a lower price increases. In this case, he might be willing to come down from a price of 45 rupees per kilo to a price of 33 rupees per kilo when you buy 3 kilos from him for rupees 100. So this is the second degree price discrimination. The third degree price discrimination comes about when you have firms selling the same product in different markets at different prices. And this can happen in the context of the international system. That is, a multinational company can sell a particular product at a different price here and might sell the same product at a different price in another country. I'll give you the example of food chains. There are some foreign food chains operating in Pakistan. There is McDonald's, there is Pizza Hut. Now, if you go abroad and ask for a typical chicken burger to a McDonald's outlet, let's say in the US or the UK, you'll find that the price that they charge for that burger will be higher if you convert the dollars or the sterling into equivalent rupees. But if you go to the local McDonald's outlet and ask for the same burger, the price will be much lower. The same holds for pizza as well. So it is possible indeed for customers to be charged different prices if they happen to exist in different markets. Now note that it is important for these markets to be separate. So for example, if customers could buy the burger in Pakistan and then resell it in the US or in the UK, then the price discrimination strategy of the firm would not work. So firms use the price discrimination or the third degree price discrimination strategy only when the markets are considered independent. Surely burgers can't be bought and then resold in America at the lower price because they are perishable items. Once they have been bought, they need to be consumed very fast. So this is an example of third degree price discrimination. Let me formalize the conditions that must be obeyed or must be satisfied for successful price discrimination to take place. I've already mentioned one, and that is that the markets to which the firm is selling to must be independent. It should not be possible to buy the good cheap and then sell it on in the expensive market, right? That should not be a possibility. The second condition is that firms should have the flexibility to charge different prices. That is, they should not be price takers. So in the market for grain, for example, where it is very difficult, or the market for gandum, it is very difficult for individual farmers to charge different prices. Certainly it is not possible to price discriminate in perfectly competitive markets, because as soon as you increase your price above the given market price, you would not be able to sell anything. So that's the second condition, that firm should have some role or some influence in setting prices. That is, they should be able to set prices. Now the third and final condition for successful price discrimination is that the firms should face consumers who have different price elasticities of demand. That is, I'll give you the example of McDonald's again. If McDonald's tried to sell the chicken burger at the same price in Pakistan that they charge in the US. They would not be able to sell that burger because the price elasticity of demand for burgers is higher in Pakistan than it might be in the US. So successful price discrimination is only possible if the price elasticities of demand are different in the two different markets or the two different types of consumers. Now, given those three types of price discrimination and the three conditions required for successful price discrimination, from now onwards I will not differentiate between the three types. All I will do is refer to price discrimination as the situation in which the prices charged for the same product can be different. So the same product can be sold at different prices. And we'll see what are the implications of price discrimination for the firm. It's obviously advantageous to a firm to be able to price discriminate, but we'll see how to formalize this. And then we'll see what are the implications of price discrimination for the public at large. So let's start by looking at an example, a graphical illustration of how price discrimination can boost a firm's profits. Now let's consider here a firm which is obviously a price maker. As you can see, it faces a downward sloping demand curve, so it's not a perfectly competitive firm, which has the option to price discriminate. Let's first see what the firm's revenues will be. Note that we will keep costs here, we'll take costs here as constant. So we'll only talk about revenues, and given that costs are constant, we can immediately derive the implications for profits. So let's first see what the revenues will be if the firm operated at point X, that is sold the entire quantity Q1 at a price of P1. Well, the revenues that the firm will make will obviously be the rectangle P1XQ1O. However, now if the firm started price discriminating, that is selling part of its product at P1 and the other part of its product at P2, that is if it sold 0 to Q2 worth of output at P2 and sold Q2 minus Q1 units at P1, then what would be the implications for revenues? Well, the implications for revenues will be that the total revenues after price discrimination will be the sum of two rectangles. The first one will be OP2TQ2, right? So that is the revenues gained for the output units from 0 to Q2. And the second part of the revenues will come from selling Q2 minus Q1 units, and that corresponds to the rectangle LXQ1Q2. Now you can see that the gain in revenues by simply price discriminating amounts to P2TXP1. So this addition in revenues will translate into addition in profits, given that costs are constant. And costs are constant, why? Because we are still producing at Q1 level of output. So that, my friends, gives you an idea. Dobara se. So that, my friends, gives you a very good idea of the advantages that price discrimination offers to any particular firm. Now let's formalize this analysis a little bit more by seeing how a price discriminating firm would maximize its profits when it is selling its goods in two different markets and charging two different prices in those two different markets. Note that the demand curves in those two different markets will be taken as different. In one market, we'll assume inelastic demand, and in the other market, we'll assume elastic demand. So let's formalize this through the use of a slide. Assume a firm sells an identical product in two separate markets, X and Y, with demand and marginal revenue curves as shown. Now, diagram C here shows the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves for the firm as a whole. This marginal revenue curve is found by adding the amount sold in the two markets at each level of marginal revenue. In other words, the horizontal addition of the two marginal revenue curves. Thus, for example, with output of 1,000 units in market X and 2,000 units in market Y, making 3,000 in total, revenue would increase by rupees 5 if one extra unit were sold, whether in market X or Y. Total profit is maximized where MC is equal to MR, and this you should know by heart by now. That is at an output here of 3,000 units in total. This output must then be divided between the two markets so that the marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue in each market. That is, marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue is equal to rupees 5 in each market. MR must be the same in both markets, otherwise revenue could be increased by switching output to the market with the higher MR. The profit maximizing price in each market will be given by the relevant demand curve. Thus, in market X, which has a more inelastic demand, 1,000 units will be sold at rupees 9 each. That is, the firm is taking advantage of the inelastic demand and charging a higher price. But in market Y, 2,000 units will be sold at rupees 7 each because the demand curve is more elastic. Now that was pretty simple. Profit maximization now appears very simple after we've done it for so many different cases. That is, for a price-taking firm, a price-making firm, that would be price, perfect competition and monopolies respectively, and now here again for the case of price-making firms. Note that price discrimination can be done by any firm which does not operate in a perfectly competitive market. So the only condition here is that the market should not be perfectly competitive. It could be a monopoly, it could be an oligopoly, it could be in monopolistic competition. So it could be all of those three cases in which price discrimination can be practiced. Now we come to the crucial and more interesting question of what the implications of price discrimination are for public interest. And we'll keep talking about public interest because this really is at the heart of the debate about all these different market structures. The underlying question that economists are trying to answer is that which market structure is the one which is most favorable to public interest, or how can we tailor or affect market structures or firms operating within given market structures to ensure that public interest is safeguarded. Now the debate about whether price discrimination hinders public interest or whether it helps public interest is not decided yet. It's a very difficult thing that to arbitrate on. There are three main issues in this matter. One relates to fairness, the other to competition, and the third one to profits. And we'll identify what the arguments are in each of these 3 points. First, let's take the issue of fairness. If you are a car owner and if you are quite wealthy and you go to the fruit shop, the fruit seller who sells you mangoes at the price of, let's say, rupees 50 per kilo, and then the next moment you find or you overhear the same mango shop or the same fruit seller setting the same kilo of mangoes to a poor person who passes by for rupees 30. Now, will you like it or will you dislike it? Well, if you're large-hearted, you will say, well, that's okay. I can pay more, so I paid more. And that poor person can't pay so much. So the fruit shop, the fruit seller charged him a lower price. But for some people, this raises the issue of fairness. And the car owner can turn around and say, why did you charge a high price to me and charged a low price to someone else? And indeed, it is possible for the fruit seller to not have a decent answer for this, especially if you're not talking about car owners, if this is a comparison between a motorcycle owner and a bicycle owner. So they might be more sensitive, very sensitive to what price is charged. On the other hand, price discrimination allows people to access goods and services that they otherwise might not have been able to. And I'll give you the example of air tickets. If you want to fly from, let's say, Lahore to let's say, London, if you go to the travel agent, and any travel agent, and ask him for the fare for that particular journey, they will ask you a number of questions. So it's still the journey from Lahore to London, but they will ask you, are you going one way, or is it a return ticket that you want to buy? Is this a ticket for an adult, or is this a ticket for a child? If it's the ticket for a child, is the child above 2.5 years, below 2.5 years? Is this ticket going to be refundable or exchangeable, or is this going to be a firm commitment on your part to fly? And how much advance time can you give for the dates that you want to fly on? Whether you can book 3 months in advance or 2 months in advance. And all sorts of questions will be thrown at you. And you might find that if you book well in advance, and if you buy a return ticket, and if you go for the non-refundable, non-exchangeable option, then you might get a very cheap ticket to London. Whereas imagine a big businessman who suddenly has an emergency meeting to attend in London, and he wants to go tomorrow, right? So he asks his travel agent, I want a flight to London tomorrow. Now the travel agent knows that this guy has to go to London no matter what. So he will charge him a high price. So obviously there are benefits to price discrimination in this case. A person, a student like yourself, or a person who does not have the amount of money to pay for the price, pay for a ticket at the price that the businessman can only fly to London on an aircraft if the price charged is low enough for him to be able to afford it. And that will only be possible if firms can or are allowed to price discriminate. So that's the question of fairness, which is not easy to arbitrate on. It's not something that you can say, no, price discrimination is unfair or fair. It depends on who you are, which market you are in, what product you want to buy, how desperately you want to buy, what is your income, and all sorts of issues. The second question is about competition. That does price discrimination boost competition or lower competition? And naturally, the public interest would get affected if price discrimination boosted competition or lowered or changed the level of competition in the market. Now, if price discrimination helps increase competition, that's good. And if it helps reduce competition, that would hurt consumers' interest. Now, some people here argue that price discrimination is used to hurt competition or reduce competition in the market. How does that happen? That would happen if the supernormal profits that price discriminating firms earn are used to advertise and build brands and deter the entry of other firms in the market. We saw how a monopolist making supernormal profits could use those profits to deter the entry of other firms into the market. And if a monopolist is price discriminating and making a lot of money through this practice, then he can do exactly that. And that will not be good from the viewpoint of competition. However, it is also possible for price discriminating firms to use their supernormal profits for innovation purposes, for inventing new techniques which lower the costs of production, for investing in research and development, and even for being able to sustain price wars in a market where there is an existing monopoly. So it's a difficult issue. So for example, if there is a single firm operating in a certain market, and that's a monopoly, and here is another firm which is also a monopoly, but which wants to enter the other market, then it can use its price, the profits that it gets through price discrimination, use them to enter the other market and sustain a price war with that other firm, and so that would increase competition in that other firm, in that other market. So it can go either way. Profits can increase, supernormal profits through price discrimination can increase competition in an industry or decrease competition in an industry. Now, the implications of price discrimination for competition were discussed in the context of profits. But profits in themselves are something that need to be talked about in greater detail in order to understand whether there are situations in which the existence of profits can actually lead to the production of a good which otherwise would not have been produced. So we are looking at a situation where a firm is running a loss, that is, it runs a loss if it produces a particular good. There is no quantity at which a single price can allow that firm to make a profit. And then we want to see if price discrimination, which allows that firm to make a certain level of profit, can then enable that firm to produce that good, and therefore that will represent an advantage for society, and that will be a protection of public interest. Let's illustrate this through the use of a graph. Now, as you can see in this graph, when the firm does not price discriminate, there is no price or no quantity at which it is able to cover its average cost. All the points on the demand curve are below the average cost curve. Therefore, no single price can allow this firm to make profits. And therefore, this good, whatever this good is, will not be produced. So, if you look at the hypothetical example of the firm setting a price P1 and producing at a quantity Q1, then it will make a revenue of OP1KQ1, but it will incur costs of OCXQ1. And as you can see, the costs are greater than the revenues. There is a loss of P1CXK. That's the rectangle there. But once the firm is allowed to price discriminate, that is, if it is allowed to sell Q2 units at a price of P2 and Q2 minus Q1 units at a price of P1, then the firm can actually begin to make profits, or there is a chance that it will make profits. What will be the total revenue in this new case under price discrimination? It will be OP2LQ2 plus Q2SKQ1. The first term represents the revenue gained due to selling OQ2 units, and the second one represents revenues gained due to selling Q1 minus Q2 units. Now, the increase in revenues has been equal to P2LSP1, and this represents the incremental profit for the firm, or the increment to revenues. And we need to see if these revenues, these additional revenues, are enough or greater than the loss that the firm was making earlier, which was P1CXK. If these additional revenues are enough to offset the loss that the firm was making, then the firm will produce the output or the good because it is now profitable to do so. So that, my friends, concludes our discussion on price discrimination and the public interest. In general, price discrimination is an important part of the decisions that firms make, whether the firms are not perfectly competitive, whether the firms are monopolists or whether they are imperfectly competitive, and we will see those two categories very soon. Then price discrimination is an option that they can explore to boost their profits and also to produce goods that would otherwise not be produced. And certainly we've seen that there are cases in which the public interest can actually benefit from price discrimination, and there are certain cases in which the public interest can be damaged as well. However, that was the discussion on price discrimination. Let's start now from where we left the discussion on monopoly. We've discussed two cases of market structure. We've discussed perfect competition and we've discussed the case of monopoly. Now we will discuss the case of imperfectly competitive market structures. And there are essentially two structures that we will discuss. We'll discuss monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So let's start with monopolistic competition. Now don't get confused by the term monopolistic competition, because it does not mean that this particular type of market structure is very close to a monopoly. No. In fact, oligopoly or cartel structures are closer to the case of monopoly, the monopoly pole of the spectrum of market structures. Monopolistic competition is in two or three very fundamental ways close to perfect competition. There is only one way in which it is different, but one very important way. And most firms that you see around us or around you either fall in the category of monopolistic competition or in the category of oligopolies. And we'll discuss these in order. Now, what makes monopolistic competition familiar to perfect competition, as I've just said? Well, there are two major assumptions. And if you recall the matrix that I showed you earlier, you can go back to that matrix and see what those assumptions are. Here I am repeating those assumptions. And the first assumption was that there are a large number of firms. That is, firms cannot, there are so many firms out there that each individual firm cannot affect the other firm's decisions or is not affected by the other firm's decisions. Each firm is independent of the other firm. So in that sense, it represents perfect competition. And that is why the word competition is in there. The second reason or the second assumption which matches that of perfect competition is that there are no barriers to entry. Any number of firms can enter the industry in the long run. As we discussed in the case of monopoly, that there were barriers to entry. Sometimes those barriers to entry were large fixed costs or the advertising campaign done by the monopolist firm. But these barriers to entry do not exist in monopolistic competition. Now, it is the third assumption which renders monopolistically competitive firms different from perfect competition. And this third assumption relates to the nature of product which is being sold. Now, in monopolistic competition, each firm sells a differentiated product. That is a slightly different product from another firm. Now, on the surface, those products might not seem different. But there is something different about the way in which they are presented or sold or offered. And that is what allows the monopolistically competitive firm to charge higher prices than the case in which there is perfect competition. Now, let me give you some examples of monopolistically competitive industries. Now, every one of us lives, wherever one lives, there are usually local general stores around us, or khokhas, right? Where you go for a soft drink or have a pan, and then there are local general stores. Now, the general store in one area might not be very different from the general store in another area. But why do you go to your local general store and not to a general store in the next locality? What could be the reason for that? One reason that comes to mind is convenience. That it is convenient for you to go to your local store because it is nearer to you. Also, it might be the case that your local store is open till 11 o'clock in the night, and therefore if some guest arrives late at night, you can go to your local store and buy the product from there at 11 o'clock in the night. Whereas you can't go to some other store nearby which is also open till 11 o'clock. So the timing for which different shops are open might serve as a differentiating factor. I'll give you the example of haircuts. You might prefer the way in which a certain person gives you a haircut to the way in which another person gives you a haircut. So maybe the person who gives you the haircut also relates a joke every time you have your haircut. And he talks about interesting issues relating to politics and what's happening in society. And you enjoy that very much. And therefore, for that reason, you go to that same hair cutter year after year after year. Right? Similarly, I love the example of a pawn shop. I always go to the same pawn shop for my pawn. Why? Because whenever I go, he gives me a nice handshake, embraces me, tells me about how his life is going, asks me about my life, and he gives me a personalized service which I appreciate, and then he also relates a joke. And I like buying pans from him. Otherwise, the pan might not be very different from the pan which is being sold by the stall holder next door or next street. So these are all ways in which firms can differentiate their products. Sometimes the differences are artificial. Sometimes the differences are very real. But there are ways in which firms can differentiate their products and therefore charge slightly different prices. Now, given this setup of monopolistically competitive firms, let's establish how equilibrium is set up or equilibrium is obtained in the short run and then eventually in the long run. Let's look at a slide for that. Now, as you can see, here is a firm which is operating in a monopolistically competitive industry. So this firm offers a differentiated product, therefore it faces a downward sloping demand curve. It is more elastic than the case for a monopoly, but it's not a horizontal line like the perfectly competitive firm faces. Now, the principle that the firm employs to operate or produce and outproduce the profit maximizing output is exactly the same as we studied earlier. It will produce that level of output at which MR is equal to MC. And that level here is when he will produce QS. So if you now take a vertical line from QS all the way up to the demand curve, you hit point S. And then if you read off the price on the vertical axis, that will give you the price that the monopolistically competitive firm will charge. Now, since the price that the firm is charging, PS, is higher than the average cost that it will incur at that quantity, you know the average cost at that quantity would be ACS, which is the point of intersection of the line SQS with the average cost curve. So the firm is allowed to make supernormal profits in the short run. These supernormal profits will be equal to, yes, SL ACS PS. Yeah, that's the rectangle that is equal to the supernormal profits that the firm is making. Now, let's see what happens in the long run. Since there are no barriers to entry in the long run, that is, other firms can come in, therefore, if the firms in the monopolistically competitive industry are making supernormal profits, more and more firms will come in. And as they come in, the supernormal profits will gradually disappear, and firms will eventually, or the new number of firms will eventually produce at the point where the demand curve is tangent or becomes tangent to the long run average cost curve. The long run profit maximization position will still be the same, that is, at the intersection of the marginal revenue curve to the long run marginal cost curve. But because supernormal profits have been driven away or eaten away due to the entry of new firms, all the firms will operate at break-even point, that is at point K. Now, if you look at that diagram carefully when you go home, you will notice that the profits that the monopolistically competitive firm makes in the short run depend on the position of the demand curve and the slope of the demand curve. The higher the slope of the demand curve, that is, the steeper the demand curve, the greater will be the distance between the price that the monopolistically competitive firm charges and the average cost of that firm, and therefore the higher the size of per unit profit. And the more right or the more shifted the demand curve is to the right, actually to the right for you, the higher the quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm will be able to sell. And therefore, that per unit profit can be made on a large number of units. So, the amount of profit that a perfectly competitive or a monopolistically competitive firm makes in the short run is a function of the location and the slope of the demand curve. Now, if you remember an earlier example that I gave you when we were discussing elasticity, we gave an example of how advertising can affect both the slope of the demand curve and its location. And we'll now revisit it. Because the monopolistically competitive firm is always trying to make the demand curve as inelastic and as shifted to the right as possible, advertising is very important in this type of market structure. But let's try to understand what advertising in itself or by itself does. Advertising tries to do two things. When you see advertisements on television or in radio or in newspapers, they're trying to do two things. Firstly, they're trying to inform you about the existence of the product. So they're telling you that this particular product is being sold for you customers. Come to us and buy this product. So one is information about the product being sold. And the second one is that they're trying to persuade you convince you or force you to buy the product. So it's basically doing two things. Now, how should any firm decide how much advertising to do? Now, obviously, advertising is not done for free. Whenever you put up an advertisement on television or in radio or in the newspapers, you have to pay money for that. So what is the optimal point at which any firm, especially firms competing in a monopolistically competitive environment, how much advertising expenditures or advertising dollars should they spend? The answer lies, my friend, in the same old trick that we studied earlier. That is, they should operate at a level or advertise to the extent where marginal revenues from advertising equal marginal cost of advertising. Right? What are the marginal revenues of advertising? The number of units that you are able to sell by spending an extra dollar or extra rupee of advertising or an extra $1,000 of advertising is the marginal revenue from advertising. And the marginal cost will be the amount of cost that you pay for each additional unit or each additional ad that you put on television. So once those two are equal, you will stop advertising. That will be the level of advertising that you will choose. You will not exceed that level of advertising and you will not fall below. That's an important thing to remember. We will revisit it again when we conclude our discussion of oligopolies and start discussion of marginal social costs. Now, finally, my friends, let's talk about something that we always like to talk about. That is the relationship between this particular type of market structure and public interest. Yes, the same beast again. And as we did in the previous lectures or the previous cases of monopoly and perfect competition, we can only see how this particular market structure affects public interest when we look at what happens to price and marginal cost. Will they be equal in monopolistically competitive markets or not? Now, we've seen earlier that the monopolistically competitive firm in the long run produces where the demand curve is tangential to the average revenue curve. So the demand curve is tangential to the average cost curve, so that the monopolistically competitive firm makes zero or normal profits. Importantly, it does not produce at the lowest point of the average cost curve. That is the point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost curve. The monopolistically competitive firm does not choose that output level. So can something be done about it? Well, let's get to that question later on. Let's try to first understand the implications of the firm producing at a level which is not equal to marginal cost in this type of market structure. Let's go to a graph. Now, as you can see, this is the diagram for a monopolistically competitive firm. Now, the demand curve, as you know, is a downward sloping demand curve. It is pretty elastic because that is what the demand curve looks like for a monopolistically competitive firm. Now, the firm is operating at a level in the long run where the demand curve is tangential to the long run average cost curve. That is at point K. So it will produce Q2 units of output at a price of P2. However, the socially optimal level, or the level which maximizes or which is most in the interest of public interest, is, yes, point L. Yes, that is the point where marginal cost is equal to price. That is also the point at which the long run average cost is at its minimum. So from a productive efficiency point of view, this is the optimal point of production. So P1 is the price which the monopolistically competitive firm should produce or should choose to set, and Q1 is the quantity that it should produce if it is to maximize the social welfare. But this exactly, P1 is exactly the point at which a perfectly competitive firm would operate or perfectly competitive firm would produce at, right? So the perfectly competitive case comes in repeatedly, comes in again and again to show us how it matches the social welfare optimum for society. Now, The important thing to note here is that the loss to society of producing at K instead of producing at L depends on the distance of K from L. If K and L are very, very close to each other, then it does not really matter whether the firm is at K or at L. And in the case of a monopolistically competitive firm, because the demand curve is very elastic, that is, it is very close to the demand curve under perfect competition, K, L, and L are likely to be very close, so that the loss to society will not be so great. Point K is reasonably close to point L, and Q2 will be very close to Q1. This contrasts with the case for monopoly, where the demand curve is inelastic and where the 2 points will be quite further apart. Note, my friends, that this cost to society, that is the cost to society which occurs because of the difference between points K and L, has to be weighed against the benefits of the extra diversity that monopolistically competitive firms give us. You know, they produce differentiated products. So we have to weigh the benefit that we derive from having different types of products, different types of hairdressers, different types of pawn sellers against the cost to society in terms of all of those producers not operating at the minimum points of their average cost. Well, this is a different weighing to make. But let's conclude today's lecture there, and tomorrow we will come back or in our next lecture, we will come back and take the issue of market structures further. We look at the case of oligopoly. Oligopoly is when there are only 2 or 3 or a few firms up to 20 operating in a market, and we'll see what the implications of that are for the firm and for the public interest. So till our next lecture, my friends, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.